Picture this, a 14-year-old girl trembling behind her bedroom door, knowing that at any moment her stepfather might walk in uninvited. This isn't just any teenager. This is the future Queen of England, and the man terrorizing her will shape her destiny in ways that will echo through history for centuries. What you're about to discover isn't the polished fairy tale of good Queen Bess that you learned in school. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about a woman who would become one of history's most powerful monarchs, but at a cost so devastating it would haunt her until her dying breath. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support means everything, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Let me take you back to 1547, to a palace where shadows danced with secrets, and where a young Elizabeth Tudor was learning her first brutal lesson about power, betrayal, and survival. Her father, the notorious Henry VIII, had just died, leaving behind a kingdom in turmoil and a teenage girl who had no idea she was about to face the most traumatic experience of her young life. The palace corridors that had once echoed with her father's booming laughter now whispered with uncertainty and fear. Elizabeth, barely 14, was trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous. Her stepmother, Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife and perhaps the only mother figure Elizabeth had ever truly known, had quickly remarried a charming, ambitious man named Thomas Seymour. To the court, he appeared to be the perfect gentleman, handsome, well-connected, and seemingly devoted to his new family. But behind closed doors, Thomas Seymour was a predator, and young Elizabeth had become his prey. Imagine being 14 years old, already struggling with the awkwardness of adolescence, your body changing in ways you barely understood, and having your stepfather regularly invade your privacy in the most disturbing ways. Seymour would burst into Elizabeth's chambers while she was dressing, claiming it was innocent fun. His eyes would linger on her developing form as she scrambled to cover herself, her face burning with shame and confusion. He would corner her for what he called playful tickling sessions that left the young princess feeling violated and confused, his hands wandering to places that made her skin crawl with revulsion. This wasn't innocent horseplay. This was a grown man systematically terrorizing a vulnerable child under his care. Elizabeth would dread the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, would lie awake at night wondering if her door was properly locked, would avoid being alone in rooms where he might find her. The confident, spirited girl who had impressed tutors with her brilliant mind began to withdraw, became jumpy and anxious, started wearing heavier clothing that covered more of her body. The psychological scars ran deeper than anyone could imagine. Night after night, Elizabeth would lie awake wondering if she had somehow invited this treatment, if she was to blame for her stepfather's inappropriate behavior. The shame and fear consumed her, creating wounds that would never fully heal. She began to associate male attention with danger, began to see affection as a weapon that could be used against her. When Catherine Parr finally discovered what was happening, walking in on one of Seymour's games, she was horrified. Despite her love for her new husband, despite the scandal it would cause, she made the painful decision to send Elizabeth away immediately. But by then, the damage was already done.
The separation from Catherine Parr, the only stable maternal figure in Elizabeth's life, felt like another deep loss. She had already lost her birth mother to execution, and now she was losing her stepmother because of troubling behavior in the household. To young Elizabeth, it seemed as though every source of comfort was taken from her, and the women she loved could not protect themselves or those they cared for. Rumors soon began to spread through the court. Courtiers whispered cruel stories, claiming improper closeness between Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour, and questioning her character. Some even invented claims of secret meetings. At just 14, Elizabeth discovered how easily a woman's reputation could be damaged by idle talk and speculation. The official inquiries that followed were harsh. Adult men questioned a teenage princess with invasive and humiliating demands for personal details. Elizabeth, displaying remarkable composure for her age, answered calmly, but the experience left lasting scars. She learned that, in her world, a woman's private life was often treated as public property. Modern historians believe that these early experiences shaped Elizabeth's defining choice never to marry. Having seen how power could be used to control and humiliate, she resolved to remain independent and to dedicate herself to her country. This decision, born of hardship, later became one of her greatest political strengths. Yet Elizabeth's challenges were far from over. When her young half-brother Edward died at 15, England plunged into a succession crisis. Her older half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic determined to restore papal authority, seized the throne and began a campaign of religious persecution. Hundreds of Protestants were executed for their beliefs, creating a climate of fear throughout the realm. Mary's suspicions extended to Elizabeth. Rebellions led by Protestants made Mary fear that her clever younger sister might be involved. To Mary, Elizabeth embodied everything she resented: Protestant faith, the legacy of Anne Boleyn, and a living reminder of the family conflicts that had defined her father's reign. One cold morning in 1554, Elizabeth woke to find armed guards surrounding her chambers. Without explanation, without trial, without even the pretense of due process, she was dragged from her home and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had met her gruesome end just 18 years earlier. As Elizabeth was rowed down the Thames toward her prison, she must have stared at the imposing stone walls growing larger with each stroke of the oars, wondering if she would follow in her mother's footsteps to the executioner's block. The irony was not lost on her. The daughter of the woman who had been beheaded for allegedly plotting against a monarch was now facing the same fate for allegedly plotting against her half-sister. History was repeating itself with cruel precision, and Elizabeth could almost hear the echo of her mother's final prayers mixing with the sound of the river water lapping against the boat. For 2 agonizing months, Elizabeth languished in her cell, the same cell where other famous prisoners had spent their final days. The walls seemed to whisper the names of the dead: Thomas More, Bishop Fisher, Lady Jane Grey, and countless others who had entered alive and left only as corpses. Every sound made her heart race. Every footstep in the corridor outside her door could have been her death warrant being delivered. Every meal might be her last. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than any physical punishment could have been. Elizabeth, who had always prided herself on her sharp intellect and quick wit, found herself reduced to a frightened animal, jumping at shadows and analyzing every word from her guards for hints about her fate. Sleep became impossible. Food tasted like ash. The walls seemed to close in a little more each day. Elizabeth's survival during this period required every ounce of intelligence and cunning she possessed. She wrote pleading letters to Mary, each word carefully chosen to convey innocence and submission without sounding false or desperate. She played the role of the submissive younger sister perfectly, knowing that one wrong word, one hint of defiance or resentment could seal her fate. She had learned to be an actress of the highest caliber, hiding her true thoughts behind a mask of perfect humility. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, Mary was convinced that Elizabeth posed no immediate threat. But instead of freedom, Elizabeth was placed under house arrest for nearly a year, confined to Woodstock Palace under constant surveillance. Guards followed her everywhere, servants reported her every word, and letters were intercepted and read before reaching her hands. She was a prisoner in all but name, living in a gilded cage where even her tears were monitored for signs of rebellion. This experience transformed Elizabeth in ways that would define her entire reign. She learned that power was the only protection against those who would destroy her, that mercy was often seen as weakness, and that sometimes the people closest to you posed the greatest threats. The frightened teenager who entered the tower emerged as a woman with nerves of steel and a heart that had learned to calculate every emotion as a potential weapon or vulnerability. During those long months of imprisonment and house arrest, Elizabeth developed what would become her greatest skill: the ability to wear masks. She learned to smile when she wanted to scream, to speak words of love when her heart burned with hatred, to appear weak when she was planning her strength. These lessons in deception would serve her well when she finally ascended to the throne, but they also meant that the real Elizabeth, the wounded, frightened girl beneath the crown, would remain forever hidden, even from those closest to her. When Elizabeth finally ascended to the throne in 1558 at age 25, those early traumatic experiences had forged her into something unprecedented: a female ruler who would bow to no one and trust no one completely. The coronation ceremony was magnificent, with crowds cheering and bells ringing throughout London, but Elizabeth knew better than to mistake public celebration for personal safety. She had learned that crowns were heavy not just of their gold and jewels, but because of the constant weight of knowing that everyone around you might be planning your destruction. But the crown that gave her ultimate power also brought with it a loneliness that would consume her for the rest of her life. Every relationship became a political calculation, every friendship a potential liability, every moment of genuine affection a dangerous vulnerability that enemies could exploit. The girl who had once trusted Catherine Parr completely would grow into a woman who could never fully trust anyone again. Despite her famous declaration that she was married to England, Elizabeth's heart was not made of stone. She fell deeply, passionately in love with Robert Dudley, a childhood friend who had grown into a devastatingly handsome and charming man. Their relationship scandalized the court and created a diplomatic nightmare, but Elizabeth couldn't help herself. For the first time since her traumatic adolescence, she had found someone who made her feel like a woman rather than just a queen. Dudley understood her in ways that no one else could. He had known her before she became untouchable royalty, had seen her laugh and cry and rage without having to worry about maintaining her royal dignity. With him, she could almost forget the weight of the crown, could almost imagine what life might have been like if she had been an ordinary woman with the right to choose her own destiny. Their love affair was conducted in stolen moments, secret meetings in garden alcoves, coded messages passed through trusted servants, glances across crowded rooms that conveyed more than volumes of poetry. Elizabeth would arrange elaborate hunts and entertainments just to have an excuse to spend time with Dudley, and courtiers began to whisper that the Virgin Queen was not quite as pure as she pretended to be. But even this great love was tinged with tragedy and impossible choices. Dudley was already married when their romance began, trapped in a loveless union with Amy Robsart, a woman who spent most of her time confined to the countryside while her husband dazzled the court in London. When Amy died under suspicious circumstances, found at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck, rumors immediately swirled that Dudley had murdered his wife to clear the way for marriage to the Queen.
Elizabeth was devastated. The man she loved was now tainted by scandal, suspected of murder by half the kingdom. Marrying him would destroy her carefully constructed image as the Virgin Queen and provide ammunition for every enemy who wanted to portray her as a woman ruled by lust rather than wisdom. She was trapped between her heart's desires and the political realities that demanded she remain untouchable, pure, and completely devoted to her subjects. The pain of this impossible choice never fully left her. Years later, after Dudley had married someone else and started the family that Elizabeth could never give him, she would still keep his letters tied with ribbons in a private box marked "My Lord's Letters."
She would still watch him from across crowded rooms with eyes that held echoes of the love she had been forced to sacrifice on the altar of queenship. The loneliness of power manifested itself in increasingly erratic behavior as Elizabeth aged. She demanded that her ladies-in-waiting dress only in black and white, ensuring that she would always be the most magnificent figure in any room. Her vanity became legendary. She owned over 2,000 pairs of gloves, each pair embroidered with intricate designs, and never wore the same outfit twice. Getting dressed each morning became an elaborate ritual that took hours, as if the perfect exterior could somehow protect the wounded girl who still lived inside the powerful queen. Her obsession with her appearance went beyond simple vanity. In a world where a queen's power depended partly on the awe and admiration she inspired, Elizabeth understood that her image was a weapon as important as any army. Every jewel, every curl of her elaborate wigs, every fold of her magnificent gowns was calculated to overwhelm observers with her majesty and make them forget that she was, after all, just a mortal woman in a world ruled by men. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Elizabeth's character was her desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of eternal youth and beauty. When smallpox ravaged her face in her 20s, leaving her scarred and causing her hair to fall out in patches, she refused to accept defeat. The disease that had killed thousands of her subjects had dared to touch the sacred person of the queen, and Elizabeth would spend the rest of her life fighting back against this ultimate indignity. She began wearing increasingly elaborate wigs, some so tall and heavy that they required special supports to prevent neck strain. The red curls that became her trademark were actually made from the hair of other women, carefully styled and maintained by a team of servants who understood that their jobs, and possibly their lives, depended on keeping the queen's secret. The wigs became more elaborate with each passing year, towering constructions decorated with pearls, ribbons, and sometimes even tiny bells that chimed softly when she moved her head. But it was the makeup that truly revealed the depth of Elizabeth's vanity and desperation. She began covering her damaged skin with thick white makeup that contained dangerous levels of lead and vinegar. This concoction, known as Venetian ceruse, was supposed to create the pale, luminous complexion that was fashionable among the wealthy, but it came at a terrible cost. As the years passed, this makeup routine became more extreme and more deadly. The lead slowly poisoned her skin, creating even more damage that required even heavier coverage. What had started as a way to hide smallpox scars became a vicious cycle of damage and concealment that was literally eating away at her face. Servants who helped apply the makeup reported that removing it each night revealed skin that looked like ancient parchment, cracked and discolored from years of chemical assault. Her remaining teeth, once white and perfect, turned black and began rotting from her excessive consumption of expensive sugar, a luxury that only royalty could afford, but that came with a devastating price. Sugar was so costly that displaying it was a symbol of wealth and power, and Elizabeth indulged her sweet tooth without restraint. Cakes, candies, preserved fruits, and elaborate sugar sculptures adorned her table at every meal, and the queen consumed them all with the appetite of someone who had never learned moderation. By the end of her life, Elizabeth only smiled with her lips pressed firmly together, hiding the decay that lurked behind her painted perfection. Foreign ambassadors reported that she would sometimes cover her mouth with a fan when speaking, and portraits from her later years show her with a tight, closed-mouth expression that became her signature look. The transformation was tragic. The vibrant young woman who had once dazzled foreign ambassadors with her beauty and intelligence had become a grotesque caricature of femininity, desperately clinging to the illusion of youth while her body betrayed her with every passing year. Yet even those who saw through her elaborate disguise dared not comment, for Elizabeth's temper had grown as formidable as her appearance was artificial. The queen, who had once been praised for her even temper and diplomatic grace, became known for explosive rages that could erupt without warning.
Courtiers learned to read the signs, the tightening around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her voice would drop to a dangerous whisper before the storm broke. When Elizabeth's fury was unleashed, no one was safe from her wrath. She would strike servants with whatever came to hand, hairbrushes, books, even her heavy rings that left marks on the faces of those who displeased her. Ladies-in-waiting who dared to marry without her permission found themselves imprisoned or banished from court, their lives destroyed by a woman who could not bear to see others find the happiness that had been denied to her. Yet even as her physical beauty faded and her temper grew more volatile, Elizabeth's political cunning only grew sharper. She understood that England's survival depended on her ability to project strength while surrounded by more powerful enemies. The great Catholic powers of Europe, Spain, France, and the Papal States, viewed Protestant England as a heretical nation that needed to be brought back into the fold by force if necessary. When Spain's mighty fleet threatened English shipping routes and Philip II began assembling what would become the famous Spanish Armada, Elizabeth made a decision that shocked the civilized world. She would turn pirates into patriots. The strategy was brilliant in its audacity and ruthless in its execution.
Sir Francis Drake and other English sea captains received official licenses called letters of marque that transformed them from common criminals into legal privateers operating with the full blessing of the English crown. These weren't random acts of piracy. They were carefully coordinated attacks designed to cripple Spain's economy and fund England's growing naval power. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, celebrated in English history books as a magnificent feat of exploration, was actually a 3-year piracy expedition that netted Elizabeth's treasury more gold and silver than the crown had seen in decades. When Drake returned to England in 1580, his ship's hold was so full of stolen Spanish treasure that it took days to unload. Elizabeth personally went aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, and knighted him on the deck while surrounded by chests of stolen gold. Elizabeth transformed theft into statecraft, piracy into patriotism. When Spanish ambassadors complained bitterly about these attacks, Elizabeth would smile sweetly behind her painted face and claim ignorance, all while counting the stolen treasure that was filling England's coffers and funding the naval expansion that would eventually defeat the Spanish Armada. This duplicitous approach extended to every aspect of her reign. Elizabeth maintained one of the most sophisticated spy networks in European history, run by the brilliant and ruthless Sir Francis Walsingham. Her agents infiltrated foreign courts, intercepted secret correspondence, eliminated threats before they could materialize, and fed disinformation to enemy spies with such skill that even today, historians struggle to separate fact from fiction in the intelligence reports of the era. Walsingham's network was so extensive and effective that it seemed almost supernatural to Elizabeth's enemies. Plots against the Queen were discovered before they were fully formed. Conspirators found themselves arrested before they had even finished planning their treachery. And foreign agents discovered that their most trusted contacts were actually English spies feeding false information back to their handlers. When Mary, Queen of Scots, became involved in a Catholic plot to overthrow Elizabeth and restore England to papal authority, Walsingham orchestrated one of the most elaborate sting operations in the history of espionage. He allowed the conspiracy to develop, even encouraged it by providing the conspirators with what they believed was a secure method of communication, all while reading every letter and documenting every detail of their treason. The method was ingenious in its simplicity. Letters were hidden in waterproof packages and smuggled in and out of Mary's prison inside beer barrels. The conspirators believed their communications were completely secure, never suspecting that Walsingham's agents were intercepting every barrel, reading every letter, and then carefully resealing the packages before allowing them to reach their destinations. Mary, desperate for any contact with the outside world after years of imprisonment, eagerly participated in the correspondence, never realizing that every word she wrote was being carefully documented as evidence for her eventual trial.
When she finally wrote a letter explicitly endorsing a plot to assassinate Elizabeth, Walsingham had all the evidence he needed to spring his trap. The decision to execute Mary was perhaps the most difficult and ruthless of Elizabeth's entire reign. Mary wasn't just a political rival, she was family, a fellow queen, a woman who had already suffered tremendous hardships, and a figure who commanded sympathy throughout Catholic Europe. Executing her would be seen as regicide, a crime so heinous that it could justify a holy war against England. But Elizabeth had learned long ago that mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. The traumatized girl who had once cowered before Thomas Seymour's advances, who had trembled in the Tower of London while awaiting her own possible execution, had grown into a woman who understood that sometimes survival required actions that would stain your soul forever. On a cold February morning in 1587, Mary Stuart walked to the executioner's block with a dignity that moved even her enemies to tears. She had dressed in crimson, the color of martyrdom, and she faced her death with a courage that Elizabeth privately admired, even as she signed the death warrant. With that single signature, Elizabeth proved once and for all that nothing, not blood, not gender, not royal solidarity, not even the threat of eternal damnation, would be allowed to threaten her grip on power. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of Elizabeth's character was how thoroughly she rejected the refined, ladylike behavior expected of a queen. She had learned to swear like a soldier from her father, Henry VIII, who was notorious for his colorful language even by the standards of his rough age. And she never bothered to clean up her vocabulary even after ascending to the throne. Imagine the shock of foreign ambassadors expecting to meet a demure, soft-spoken lady, only to encounter a monarch who could out-curse any sailor in her navy. Elizabeth's favorite oath, God's wounds, was considered so blasphemous that even hardened soldiers winced when she used it, but she deployed it regularly and with obvious relish when dealing with courtiers who had disappointed her. This crude language wasn't just a personal quirk, it was another weapon in her arsenal. In a world where men constantly questioned whether a woman could rule effectively, Elizabeth's willingness to speak like one of them sent a clear message. She will not be confined by anyone's expectations of proper feminine behavior. She will curse, she will rage, she will spit and scratch and fight like any king if that's what it took to command respect. Behind all the political maneuvering and public spectacle, Elizabeth maintained a deeply private connection to the mother who had been stolen from her when she was just 2 years old. Anne Boleyn had been branded a traitor and a witch, her memory officially erased from royal history, her very name forbidden to be spoken in Elizabeth's presence during the reigns of her father and siblings. But Elizabeth found subtle ways to honor her mother's memory throughout her life, acts of quiet rebellion that revealed the depth of her love and loyalty to the woman who had given her life. She wore lockets containing miniature portraits of Anne hidden beneath her elaborate gowns, where no one could see them but where she could feel them against her heart. She displayed jewelry bearing her mother's initials, the intertwined A and B that had once decorated Anne's own possessions. Perhaps most tellingly, Elizabeth consistently promoted and favored men who had been loyal to Anne during her brief, tragic reign as queen. These weren't necessarily the most qualified candidates for high office, but they were men who had shown kindness to her mother during those terrifying final months when the king's favor had turned to deadly hatred. These quiet acts of remembrance reveal perhaps the most human side of Elizabeth, a daughter who never stopped loving the mother she barely remembered, who carried the pain of that loss throughout her entire life. The little girl who had been taught that her mother was evil and shameful grew into a woman who quietly rebelled against that narrative every single day. As Elizabeth aged, her need for affection and attention became almost desperate. The queen who had spent decades surrounded by courtiers and advisors found herself increasingly isolated by the very power that defined her existence. Everyone wanted something from her: titles, lands, money, influence, but no one could simply love her as a woman rather than worship her as a monarch. In her final years, she became infatuated with Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who was 33 years younger than her.
Essex was everything that the aging queen was not: young, beautiful, vital, and completely unaware of his own mortality. The court watched in fascination and horror as the aging queen, her face a mask of white paint and her head crowned with an elaborate red wig that made her look like a grotesque doll, flirted shamelessly with a man young enough to be her grandson. The relationship was both touching and tragic. Elizabeth, desperate for genuine affection in her final years, showered Essex with gifts, titles, and opportunities. She made him one of her most trusted military commanders despite his obvious inexperience, defended him when other courtiers complained about his arrogance and incompetence, and allowed him liberties that would have gotten any other man imprisoned or executed. But even this late-in-life romance ended in betrayal and bloodshed. Essex, emboldened by the Queen's obvious favoritism and convinced of his own invincibility, eventually led a rebellion against her authority. When his military campaigns failed and his debts mounted, he decided that the solution was to force Elizabeth to dismiss her other advisors and rely entirely on him for guidance. The rebellion was pathetic in its execution, a handful of nobles marching through London streets, expecting the common people to rise up and support them, only to find themselves surrounded by loyal troops and arrested like common criminals. But the betrayal cut Elizabeth deeper than any physical wound could have done. When the moment came to choose between her heart and her crown, Elizabeth didn't hesitate. The man she may have loved more than any other met his end on the executioner's block, another sacrifice to the insatiable demands of absolute power. She signed his death warrant with a steady hand, but courtiers reported that she aged visibly in the days that followed, as if something essential had died within her, along with the young man who had briefly made her feel alive again. Perhaps most remarkably, throughout her entire reign, Elizabeth sought guidance not just from traditional advisors, but from one of the most mysterious figures in English history, John Dee, a scholar who was simultaneously a brilliant mathematician and a practicing alchemist and astrologer. While other European courts were beginning to embrace scientific rationalism and move away from medieval superstitions, Elizabeth regularly consulted Dee about everything from military strategy to the best dates for important ceremonies based on astrological calculations. Dee represented the contradictions that defined Elizabeth herself. She was simultaneously progressive and traditional, rational and superstitious, strong and desperately vulnerable. He encouraged her imperial ambitions while also claiming to communicate with angels through mystical rituals involving crystal balls and ancient incantations. This partnership between queen and magician reveals an Elizabeth who was far more complex and intellectually curious than the simplified historical narrative suggests. When Elizabeth died in 1603 at age 69, she left behind an empire that stretched across oceans, but also a personal tragedy that would haunt English history for centuries. The woman who had transformed England from a weak, divided nation into a global powerhouse had paid for that success with every aspect of her personal happiness. She had never known the joy of marriage, the fulfillment of motherhood, or the peace of trusting another person completely. The girl who had been traumatized by her stepfather's abuse, who had faced execution by her own sister, who had learned that love was just another battlefield where victory required sacrifice, had become exactly what England needed: a ruler whose strength came from her wounds, whose power was forged in the fire of unimaginable suffering. Elizabeth I wasn't just a great queen. She was a survivor who transformed her trauma into triumph, her isolation into independence, and her pain into the kind of strength that could move mountains and reshape nations. She proved that sometimes the most broken people become the most powerful, not despite their wounds, but because of them. The Virgin Queen died as she had lived, alone, undefeated, and absolutely, utterly magnificent in her terrible, beautiful solitude. Her final words, whispered to her faithful ladies-in-waiting as she lay dying, were reportedly, "All my possessions for a moment of time." Even in death, she remained what she had always been, a woman who had traded everything human for power,
and who had never quite decided whether the bargain had been worth it.